It was 1:23 a.m. The night shift was running a routine safety test. In 4 seconds, everything changed. What happened inside Reactor Number 4 at the Chernobyl Nuclear Power Plant on April 26, 1986, was not supposed to be possible. The engineers had been told the reactor was safe. The safety manual said it could not explode. It exploded. And what followed, the lies, the heroes, the abandoned city frozen in time, would shake the entire world to its foundation. To understand Chernobyl, you must first understand what it meant to the Soviet Union. Nuclear power was not just energy, it was ideology. It was proof that Soviet science and Soviet engineering were superior to everything the West could produce. The Communist Party held up their nuclear program as the crowning achievement of their civilization. Chernobyl, officially the Vladimir Lenin Nuclear Power Plant, was the jewel in that crown. Located in northern Ukraine, 130 kilometers from Kiev, it sat on the banks of the Pripyat River. By 1986, it had 4 working reactors and 2 more under construction. It powered entire regions. It was the future. The city of Pripyat was built to serve it. Founded in 1970, it was one of the youngest cities in the Soviet Union. The average age of its residents was just 26. Young engineers and their families. Scientists. Teachers. Children who had never known any other home. The city had everything. Supermarkets stocked better than most Soviet cities, a cultural center, a sports complex, a river port. And on the edge of town, a brand new amusement park, its Ferris wheel, freshly painted yellow, scheduled to open on May 1st for the Soviet Labor Day celebrations. On the evening of April 25, 1986, the families of Pripyat went to sleep without fear. They had every reason to feel safe. Inside the plant that same evening, the night shift prepared for a safety test on Reactor Number 4. The test had a specific purpose. Engineers needed to know whether, during a power outage, the turbines could generate enough residual electricity to run the reactor's cooling pumps for the 60 to 75 seconds it took for backup diesel generators to start. It was a known gap in the safety system, and this was the 4th attempt to solve it. The previous 3 attempts had all failed. From the very beginning of this attempt, problems accumulated. The test had been delayed 10 hours because the electricity grid controller in Kiev needed the power. This pushed the test into the night shift, a crew that had not been briefed or trained for the procedure. As operators prepared the reactor, they were required to reduce its power to a low level. During this process, the power dropped far lower than intended, nearly to 0. This left the reactor in an unstable, dangerous condition called xenon poisoning, where a buildup of a radioactive gas made the reactor extremely difficult to control. The correct response was clear: shut down the reactor and wait at least a day for conditions to stabilize. The shift foreman made a different decision. Under pressure to complete the test that had already been delayed 10 hours, he ordered the operators to continue. It was the last decision he would ever make at Chernobyl. At 1:23:40 on April 26, 1986, the test began. The reactor was deeply unstable. Power levels began fluctuating dangerously. Within seconds, it became clear that something was wrong. An operator pressed the emergency shutdown button, the AZ-5 button, which was designed to lower all control rods into the reactor simultaneously and stop the chain reaction. What happened next was the result of a fatal design flaw that Soviet engineers knew about, but had classified as a state secret. The control rods, as they entered the reactor, briefly caused a surge in power rather than reducing it. In a stable reactor, this effect was manageable. In a xenon-poisoned, unstable reactor running at low power, it was catastrophic. Reactor power spiked to 30 times its maximum safe capacity in less than 3 seconds. The water coolant instantly flashed to steam. Pressure built faster than any containment system could manage. At 1:23:44, exactly 4 seconds after the emergency button was pressed, the first explosion tore through Reactor Number 4. It was a steam explosion of devastating force, powerful enough to hurl the 1,000-ton reactor lid through the roof of the building. 2 seconds later, a second explosion, this one a thermal explosion that sent a column of burning graphite, nuclear fuel, and radioactive material 1,000 meters into the night sky. The reactor core was open to the atmosphere, and it was on fire. In Pripyat, people woke to the sound of the explosions. They looked out their windows toward the plant and saw something extraordinary. A pillar of light rising into the sky. Blues and purples and deep reds, an almost beautiful glow against the night. Curious residents went outside. Some walked to a railway bridge that offered a clear view of the plant. That bridge is now known as the Bridge of Death. The people who stood on it that night received radiation doses that were almost certainly fatal. They did not know. They watched the light show and went back to sleep. Inside the plant, the first firefighters arrived within minutes of the explosion. They had been told it was a standard roof fire, possibly caused by a short circuit. No one mentioned radiation. They climbed onto the roof of the building adjacent to the reactor. They walked through chunks of graphite, pieces of the reactor core itself, without knowing what it was. Some picked it up with their bare hands. One firefighter later described how his hand felt like it was burning from the inside out. He thought it was the heat from the fire. It was not the heat. Within hours, the first responders began showing symptoms of acute radiation syndrome, an overwhelming nausea, a strange metallic taste in the mouth, skin that blistered and peeled as if from a severe burn. Several collapsed before dawn. 134 first responders were diagnosed with acute radiation syndrome. 28 died within months. Their names are inscribed on a memorial in the Chernobyl exclusion zone, men who walked into the most radioactive environment on Earth to keep the fire from spreading to the other reactors. Had those reactors caught fire, had the graphite in the other cores ignited, the explosion and radiation release could have made half of Europe uninhabitable for decades. They held the line, at the cost of their lives. While the firefighters were dying, the Soviet government was deciding what to tell the world. The answer initially was nothing. For 36 hours after the explosion, the 50,000 residents of Pripyat received no official information. The plant had exploded. The reactor core was burning. Radiation levels in the city were thousands of times above safe limits. And the government said nothing. Party officials feared that an evacuation would cause panic. More than that, they feared what an admission of disaster would mean for the Soviet nuclear program, for Soviet prestige, for the ideology that Soviet technology did not fail. So they waited. Residents of Pripyat went about their Saturday normally. Children played outside in the spring sunshine that was carrying invisible lethal particles of radiation from the burning reactor just a few kilometers away. A wedding was held. People went to the market. The dosimeters, radiation measuring devices that workers carried, gave readings that went off the scale. Officials confiscated them and replaced them with instruments that had lower maximum readings. On paper, the radiation was manageable. It was not manageable. Finally, on the afternoon of April 27th, 36 hours after the explosion, buses arrived in Pripyat. A voice on the city loudspeaker announced an evacuation. Residents were told to bring documents, money, and food for 3 days. You will be back soon, they were told. Leave your pets. You won't need much. 1,200 buses evacuated 50,000 people in less than 3 hours. They left behind their furniture, their photographs, their pets, their lives. They were told it was temporary. It was not temporary. The Soviet government continued its silence to the outside world until it became impossible to maintain. Swedish nuclear workers, 1,000 kilometers from Chernobyl, arrived at work on April 28th and set off radiation alarms. The contamination was on their clothing. They had not been anywhere near Ukraine. Sweden confronted the Soviet Union. Only then, 2 days after the explosion, did the Soviets admit that an accident had occurred. Their official statement described it as a minor incident that had been brought under control. The fire at the reactor core burned for 10 days. Today, a massive steel structure called the New Safe Confinement covers what remains of Reactor Number 4. It is the largest movable structure ever built. It will need to contain the reactor for at least 100 years. The exclusion zone around Chernobyl covers 2,600 square kilometers. It will remain contaminated for thousands of years. Pripyat is completely abandoned. Nature has reclaimed its streets. Trees grow through apartment floors, foxes den in the old-school gymnasium. The rusting Ferris wheel turns slowly in the wind. In the classrooms, Textbooks are still open to April 1986. In the apartments, family photographs still hang on walls. In the amusement park, the bumper cars still sit exactly where they were parked on the morning of the evacuation. No one ever came back for 3 days. Historians argue to this day whether Chernobyl caused the collapse of the Soviet Union or merely accelerated it. Mikhail Gorbachev himself said the explosion was perhaps the real cause of the Soviet collapse, the moment when the gap between what the government said and what was true became impossible to ignore. A reactor that could not explode, exploded. A disaster that was under control, burned for 10 days. A 3-day evacuation that is now 4 decades long. Chernobyl was not just a nuclear disaster. It was the moment the world learned that some lies are too large to contain. Subscribe to Echoes of Collapse. Every week, another moment when history changed forever.